I am Alexandra Leonhart. I am a professor at Pennsylvania College of Art and Design. I teach some fun little classes there. I'm kind of new to the game design space, and I'm super excited by it. And I'm about to leave my position to go and get my PhD in design and study ludonarrative stuff. So I'm a newbie to all this, and this is awesome. And I'm super excited. And so this is like a celebration. This is kind of like a come with me on this exceptionally potentially misadventure, because we're going to see how this kind of goes, because I built it in PowerPoint and there was like some fun interactivity. And I don't know how it translates to a PDF. So we already have some kind of fun stuff. So let's start with my talk is called Ergodic Narrative and a Brief Exploration of Multimodal Video Game Engagement, because I thought it sounded good and I thought it would help me get in my PhD. My point it did. So it's great. So preemptive thank you to that already. So I got it. Like, what do we talk about? Well, usually we reference cybertext, which is like a formable text. It's been mentioned sometimes before, right? It's kind of divisive now because we've kind of built onto that and we've kind of like learned more about it. But what do we say when we actually mean Ergodic literature? And this kind of extend a little bit further. And if the interactivity doesn't work, you'll just have to deal with like kind of improvisation. Basically, it's non-trivial engagement, right? It's ergodic literature, ergodic text, ergodic engagement. It requires the participant to basically take a little bit of extra effort and to interpret and process and understand. And through this navigation, potentially additional meaning, potentially more narrative meaning might be discovered. So doesn't necessarily mean that just because it takes a little bit more effort that it's diminished in any way, right? It could be, but usually it can be some sort of strengthening to that. And so we have kind of some classic ergodic literature that's kind of been mentioned here. Of course, actually, right before the series of lightning talks with Zach Dodson's his awesome work That's the Republic. They have this idea of like this is kind of like an external multimodal experience of like you're potentially moving between different pages, but you also have this external elements of like envelopes and maps and such. But then you also have classic House of Leaves, where it works really like internally from like a text block standpoint. You're physically turning this book to gain more information. You're looking at footnotes. You're looking at these aspects that are directing you from one place to another, kind of like a choose your own adventure book, where you're basically anytime you're breaking that aspect of like, hey, at least in English, left to right, down, top to bottom, basically. I think it's beautiful and wonderful, and I was excited by this, and a lot of things were swimming in my head, and so this is what kind of gave birth to this. And kind of part of this kind of talking where we kind of moved into like interactive media and interactive fiction and video games at large was like, where does this kind of sit? Because we know we're kind of talking about this kind of beautiful collaboration that happens between the author who's creating these narrative structures, who's creating these beats, and then the participants who are choosing which path to go on and what path they're shutting off. And what path they're exploring, and then of course the algorithm, the computational assemblage, this collaboration with your computer to say, hey, randomize this, or hey, provide these options to your individuals and such. I have some other examples like the I Ching. That would be kind of like a side of like divination and like tarot cards, where you're getting these structures and the cards are being turned to the side or upside down, and then you kind of develop some sort of narrative around that too. So anyway, all this stuff is like swimming in my head, and I'm like, oh, that's so great, and like phenomenology and object memory, and let's talk about like a cyborg manifesto and like heterotopia and like windows within windows, and we got games within games, and this apparatus kind of aspect of like using a keyboard, and there's some sort of level of like cognitive awareness to your engagements, right? Like as I click down and up on this sort of thing, there's this sort of thing. So there's this all swimming around in my head, and I'm like, what's my own like? What's my weird like kind of we don't have a slide. We have a slide missing. What's my weird taxonomy missing? So you missed my like Russell's paradox joke, but that's okay. Wow, that really hit. So taxonomy of musing. So I'm like thinking of these things. I'm like, what am I noticing like through engaging with these media and stuff like that? I'm like, well, I'm noticing like this internal like recontextualization. Let's just kind of like allow what we were talking about. That like, okay, inside the medium, we're being our rule set is changing on how we're used to engaging with this. And then external like multimodal engagement. Okay, something is telling us to leave our medium and engage with other media to gain information and to process this. And then kind of these kind of aspects of that, like flow displacement, as these kind of I can kind of think about who was it, Matt Carney, who did a wonderful talk yesterday, and like information gathering of like oh, what was it called? I don't have my notes on it because of things. He talked about like berry picking and all those. It was the second one, not encouragement or encounter. Thank you. Encounters like that, where we're like our context is we're being recontextualized with a different kind of engagement, and then of course obfuscation of just being like literally withholding information, and then this desire for us to kind of gain more insight into that withheld information, and have that revealed. So through that, through this little love letter, let's talk about some of these and a little bit more. Let's talk about the OG internal redirects. These are your choose your own adventures. We're flipping to a new page, right? We're going, we've met a new gentleman. You flip to page 9 to kiss him, or 72 to kill him. Those sort of things. This could be something like more interactive, and like the interactive storytelling of like Dungeons and Dragons, right? We have this source page, unless you have like an eidetic memory. You got this source page that you re-reference back to as you collaboratively storytell. And this, of course, is where like a lot of this, aspect of like hypertext and twine in games at large. I don't know if this will work, but initially we had like an interactive component here where we're going to do a brief hypertext element here, which I know that some reviewing a lecture about some wonky narrative elements, and the professor's going on pontificating about the multimodal, multimedia, whatever engagements. What do we do? Do we make break forward? Do we go to take a deep breath until we envision a holiday? What do we do? Deep breath. Can I do it? Can I do it? Oh, let's see. Deep breath. Will this work? No, it won't work. So we'll just go. Pretend it's working. Okay. Deep breath. You take a deep breath and try to refocus and find some facets of the subject actually interesting to anchor yourself in the hopes that you glean something useful for you. Surprisingly, it works, and you are smiling obliquely, taking another breath. This time accidentally touching your throat off guard, resulting in a small coughing fit. But despite your embarrassment, at least you'll be ready should there be any quizzes. So ideally, in a more a better timeline than what we're in, this would have worked, and you would have seen, and we would have poured it on to the next thing. But you would have had an experience of hypertense, right? The next one is kind of the physicality or the displacement of some of you who are distinguished like me of a certain age might recall Phillies and like Infocom Phillies, and that's where I kind of got this kind of element from of like, okay, well, we've got these elements, we've got these interactive media, and then we quite literally there's a whole thing of being like, let's talk about like where we are, but that's already there. But we're this element of like, okay, we've got this interactive game, but to talk about Informed Comms Detective, it was a text interactive game, interactive fiction in the 80s. Infocom's amazing. You guys know this. But to be able to solve it, it came with feelies, it came with folders, right? And for this one particularly, there was like folders, case files. To be able to solve it, you had to reference that case file to succeed, right? So this required you to disengage from that medium and go and look at that. A more modern iteration, of course, Metal Gear Solid 1, which is always fun to talk about because it's just wacky, right? Like there's a lot of interesting things of unplugging controllers and like Mantis like reading your card information. In this particular instance, just sticking with this particular theme, at one point in time it asks you, says, hey, the code's on the box and such. And you come to realize and find out that there's a code here. We zoom in, and we have this code here that tells you what code to put in to play the game. So it brings you out and brings you back in. And so you have these options there, which are really interesting. And then other kind of aspects of these kind of external elements of like some aspects of like the initial cybertext was like, oh, you can't like contain a game within a single experience, but we could argue like FAQs or game guides might be kind of the antithesis of that. It might prove that you could. But game guides being this element that you could kind of reference. Certainly, I use Final Fantasy VII as somebody else who kind of grew up with that game, where it was at the time when that game came out, it felt like almost necessary to have the game or the game guide to navigate that experience, right? And so to kind of prove this point of like external knowledge and such, I was like, well, what room are we in? And then you all could kind of, think to yourself because you have better memories than me, or you could go out there and physically look and say, oh, we're in room 359 or something like that. And we'd say, oh, started there in this there's 3 of us. Kind of fun, kind of cool. But you'd know that by potentially, if you didn't already have that information, you could look at your direction of all the different kind of talks here, and say, hey, there's 3 Alexes going, which is kind of cool. And then kind of like, let's look at these kind of methods in this like displacement and what kind of like call adjusted rules, which is cool. So we look at things like Death Stranding, and this is kind of an interesting space because Death Stranding, you have this 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 game that's pretty established, but it's being adjusted by through network, through other players who are leaving these ladders to help you and such. Probably the negative version of that would be like a Souls-like, where they're like, they might be helping you or they might be trolling you, sort of thing. But you leave this message, and fundamentally, the point is that it fundamentally changes your experience. Somebody has changed your game, right? Or programmatically internalized in Baba is You. It's a game. It's a cute GIF when it works. And there's you're programmatically sliding these blocks and it's creating these small little programmatic snippets that allow you to change the fundamentals of the game. Or quite literally, the winning outcome required of the game if you haven't played that game. So here you say wall is stop, you can move the stop, and then suddenly you can move through walls and stuff. So you fundamentally have changes. Doki Doki Literature Club, also another classic one that was mentioned a couple times in a couple of talks. A fascinating talk by Tommy and stuff like that about that. Were to succeed, to get the best ending, if you will. 5 minutes, thank you. I need that a lot. The best ending, you're physically going in and you're changing the files. You're deleting files. You're fundamentally changing that game that you have to then reinstall. And to get a successful ending, you would you have to kind of destroy it in a particular manner. I think this kind of also kind of talks a little bit to Alex's initial talk on you can kind of apply this to kind of like the surrounding aspect of like social media and theater and MUDs and forums, and this kind of idea that you can kind of, you're constantly playing a role in Avatar and the rules are changing and you're kind of doing this yes and theater to a degree and such. Here there was going to be a cute thing where I had this slide here and I was like, oh no, I'm going to delete this slide and now we're going to continue to kind of show that sort of thing. We can't do that. It's a PDF. So once again, bear with me. I'm like, oh no, the slide here. It's a bunch of jokes about like Murphy Law and like Pascal and stuff. So we'll go through that and I'll leave you with that. And so then let's kind of wrap up the lab kind of tidbit here of obscuring language. And I think obscuring language is kind of this interesting aspect. It's also going to relay like language is delightful and has many meanings, right? And so we look at things like classic kind of obtuse moon logic puzzles like King's Quest one, which granted I love King's Quest, but we have like a classic. We go and we find an old gentleman who says, "Oh, you can guess if you guess my name, you can progress on, right?" And you say, "Oh, well, it's Rumpelstiltskin." Like I've had years to prepare for this through Grimm's fairy tales, but you go there and then he's like, "No, that's not it." And then you see some additional information in the game that says, "Oh no, you have to speak to them in backwards and stuff." And you're like, okay, I'll type Rumpelstiltskin's in backwards. But no, it's much more obtuse than that. You have to translate. This is a spoiler alert, but I feel like you probably had time to play that game, you know, when it came out. But you translate the alphabet in reverse and then use that. And so like that's kind of like a more extreme version. A more classic like retrograde version would be like Loom, where it doesn't have to be literal language, right? This is the language of music. You use spells to cast you use music to cast spells, and it's not giving you any kind of information. So you're there and you cast the spells and it freezes things or something like that. And eventually you come to this conclusion, or you get super desperate and you wait 10 years for the internet to become prominent, and then you Google and it says, oh, well, think about like playing a melody backwards. Maybe it has the opposite effect. And so you have this, once again, from Matt Kearney's kind of talk, what was it, engagement, encountering, where you kind of use this clues and you kind of think about these things and you come to this conclusion. And then you play the melody in retrograde and then you get the opposite effect and it allows you to kind of progress through the game. And then just kind of literal ones, whether it's like House of Leaves, like kind of like, do you know French and English to kind of navigate that book? Or of course, like Final Fantasy X, where it's like Almed primers, right? It's just a literal art laying. You're going there. You're kind of you're getting like kind of a piece, like a letter at a time to kind of navigate. So anyway, these are just things that were like interesting to me and fascinating as I kind of depart on my initial journey. So thank you for this kind of initial misadventure of me kind of exploring these things. And I know we probably don't have much time, but I would love anybody's thoughts or anybody's kind of connections that made. So thank you. Yeah.
Just 5 minutes for questions.
Really? Oh, great. Oh, I get to. Okay. Yes.
Story elements or plot elements or just any kind of things that may lend themselves best to one of these categories.
Oh, gosh. I'm going to be honest with you. I didn't suspect that there would be any questions because I figured that I would ramble too long. The question was for people to hear, was there any kind of themes or narrative beats that would particularly lend to like maybe ergodic literature at large?
Like one of the
Oh, I don't know, but I would love to find out. I would assume that's the joy of the challenge of like developing is that try and apply anything to it, and then that's where the kind of magic happens, where you say, oh, well, I mean, I would say probably the more aggressive or violent things probably would be better to stick away from maybe like certain aspects of like literature. Yes.
Would you consider poetry to be a form of ergodic literature?
Would I consider poetry to be a form
How many certain kinds?
ergodic literature?
Yeah.
I'm not sure. There's a whole interesting aspect of like computational literature and computational poetry, and that certainly feels kind of in that way. I have a very open definition of poetry, so I would.
Because sometimes you can argue that to use your definition, to fully like comprehend and parse a piece of poetry, it takes non-trivial effort.
Yeah, especially like certain like phrases and beats and stuff. I think it's I think there's certainly lots of poetry out there that does meet a very clean definition. Yes. Oh, yes.
He also wrote Only Revolutions, which is a epic poem where I think it hits a lot of those things. You have to like read 9 pages of one half and flip the book and read 9 pages from the other side of the book. There's a lot of references to things that are like outside of the kind of mention. I think that might be
absolutely. So there's certainly ergodic poems in the strictest sense out there. Sounds like one from the author of House of Leaves. Yes.
Your discussion of feelings, as a fellow old person, when video games would try to stop you from copying them, and they would add things like,
Yeah.
what's word 3 on page 25, or use this excerpt from the Encyclopedia for Physica Resort to answer some question, just to do that. And I wonder to what extent that is a form of multimodality in a game versus just a pain in the ass that they've included. And if not, what's the line between copy protection and something that actually is there to add to the ergodicity or multimodality of the literature?
That's a fascinating kind of aspect. I would say yes, it is. It's just not very interesting or very good. But because like that's where we were, and that's what made Metal Gear Solid 1 kind of interesting in that is they're like, hey, there's like a code, but it's like a screenshot. We're not doing that. We're not doing that boring thing that people would have been doing at that time, where they like put in the actual like the ISBN code thing or whatever. I think that's interesting. I think there's something to be said there, and it kind of mirrors the aspect of like gaming literacy too, of like how do we teach people how to engage or play in a way that doesn't feel like we're putting yellow paint of where to go next. And I think that's kind of a similar way of like how do you check copyright in a clean and kind and ideally not noticed way. But also, I mean, as somebody who's kind of like getting more and more as I get older, I get like more like, yeah, Linux and open software and stuff. And so I'm kind of like everything's free for me personally. I'm just like, make all your things free. I know we live in a capitalist nightmare, but nevertheless.
We make the capitalist nightmare?
To make it fun. Yes.
Because of some of the things we manipulate, so you can't basically put them from off forever. Do you have any thoughts on how things can adapt to the different models with the physical reference?
I think that's excellent. I think actually, once again, referencing Zach Dodson, he kind of talks about like the interesting aspects and challenges that he's been navigating with like having a multimodal kind of ergodic experience into like an e-publish, right? I think there's wild spaces for creativity though, right? Like whether it's like, hey, I'm putting my game on itch. Let me know if you bought it. I'll send me your address and I'll send you a postcard. Or whether it's providing like an ebook style aspect. But I think there's so many avenues for. I haven't particularly thought of it yet because I'm kind of at the beginning of my game journey. But check in with me next year and. Yes.
I do agree with you. Where you're like, you have to go on the internet and look up different answers of where you're supposed to go. And I think, there's another indie game, like Chinatown Equity, that's trying to do that, bring that kind of style back.
That's true from like a digital, like, multimodal engagement, just like hyperlinking to literally a website, or I mean, like, when we look at this in like a very simple way of like, oh, well, what's Ergodic about like regular video games is just like menu diving, right? But this aspect, oh, there's lots of hands up. Okay, okay, that's all right. Please come up and, let me talk to you later.